Margaret had spent her entire life on that Pennsylvania farm, tending the fields and caring for the land with hands calloused from decades of work. Every corner of the farmhouse, every rusted tool in the barn, every stone lining the garden held a memory, a whispered laugh with her late husband, the soft giggles of her children running through the orchard, the warmth of long, golden sunsets across rolling fields. This farm was more than soil and timber. It was her legacy, her identity, the imprint of a life built with love and sacrifice. Her son, Daniel, had grown under her care, a boy with bright eyes and endless curiosity. She had nurtured him through scraped knees, heartbreaks, and dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of the farm. She had cheered him on through school plays and college applications, never once imagining that one day, the boy who once held her hand as he learned to walk would turn into a man who might crush her heart. In recent years, however, Daniel had begun to change. Small requests for money or advances on his inheritance became sharper, tinged with impatience and entitlement. Margaret had always refused, knowing that the farm wasn't just property. It was her husband's memory, a symbol of generations who had poured their lives into it. Yet each refusal seemed to sow a quiet resentment in him, a darkness that she tried to ignore. She had warned herself countless times that greed could twist even the kindest hearts. But she had never, not in her most cautious nightmares, imagined that her own son could betray her. The thought was so alien, so painful, that she could barely acknowledge it. And yet, as the crisp autumn winds whispered through the old oak trees surrounding the farmhouse, she sensed a storm gathering, a storm that would test every ounce of her strength. Margaret moved through her kitchen, preparing tea in the early morning light, each motion habitual, grounding her in the life she had built. She thought of her husband, of the promises they had made to protect this land, and of the duty she now carried alone. The farm was more than inheritance. It was a covenant, a bond that could not be broken by blood alone. And somewhere in the silence of the house, Daniel's shadow loomed, his intentions hidden but unmistakable. Margaret's heart clenched, a premonition of the betrayal that would soon shatter the peace she had cultivated for decades. She did not yet know how close it was, nor how violently her life was about to change. But she felt it deep in her bones. The roots of betrayal were taking hold, and the storm had already begun. The day started like any other, with the golden Pennsylvania sunlight spilling across the farm and the scent of damp earth filling the air. Margaret was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, the rhythmic motion of her hands calming her mind, when the front door slammed open. Daniel stood there, his eyes sharp, his jaw tight. Gone was the hesitant son who once clutched her hand at night. In his place was a man driven by a greed she barely recognized. He demanded the farm, his voice rising with every word, the entitlement in his tone slicing through the quiet morning like a knife. Margaret set down the rolling pin, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I will not give you the farm, Daniel. It is my life, your father's legacy, not a commodity to be taken by force." For a moment there was silence, a stillness so profound that Margaret thought he might leave. But then something inside him snapped. Anger flared, and with a force she could never have imagined, Daniel shoved her. She fell. The world tilted, the stairs rushing toward her in a blur. Pain exploded in her body as she hit the steps, ribs bruising, her head spinning. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might not rise again. Her son, her own blood, stood over her, his face a mask of fury and frustration. When she found her voice, it was trembling, a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Why, Daniel, how could you?" Her words trailed into silence. The answer was clear in his eyes. He wanted the farm, and he didn't care about the mother who had given him everything. Margaret spent the rest of the day in quiet recovery, moving carefully, each step a reminder of her vulnerability. The pain in her body was immense, but the pain in her heart was deeper. She felt the sting of betrayal more sharply than any bruise or cut. The man she had nurtured, the boy she had loved unconditionally, had become a stranger, a predator in the skin of her child. She could not call the authorities yet. Daniel would twist the story, paint her as hysterical or delusional. No, she had to survive first. She had to gather her strength, and as she lay in bed that night, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, a seed of resolve took root in her heart. He had taken her by surprise, but she would not be defeated. The storm had arrived, and though it had bruised her body and shaken her soul, it had not broken her spirit. Margaret whispered into the dark, "You may have pushed me down, Daniel, but I will rise. And when I do, you will see what it means to betray the one who gave you everything." The days after the fall were a haze of pain and reflection. Margaret's body ached with every movement, each step a reminder of the force that had been used against her. Yet it was not the bruises or the stiffness that haunted her most. It was the look in Daniel's eyes, the betrayal etched so deeply that it could never be erased. That night, as she sat by the window watching the moon cast silver across the fields, a quiet resolve began to stir within her. She realized that revenge would not come from anger alone. It would require patience, cunning, and strategy. The farm was her legacy, but it was also her weapon. She began to study the land, the finances, and the laws that governed inheritance. Every document, every ledger, every forgotten detail became a tool in her arsenal. Where Daniel had relied on brute force and arrogance, she would rely on intelligence and foresight. Margaret also began to reconnect with the community, carefully repairing the relationships that had frayed over the years. She visited neighbors, helped with chores, offered guidance, and listened to their stories. They had always respected her, but now they saw the strength behind her quiet demeanor. Little by little, she gained allies, people who valued the farm and its history as much as she did, and who instinctively recognized Daniel's greed. Her encounters with Daniel became a subtle game of wits. She spoke calmly, masking every emotion, even as he tried to provoke her. She offered him nothing, not a glance of weakness, not a hint of despair. In her silence, he began to underestimate her, assuming that age and injury had diminished her spirit. But Margaret's mind was sharper than ever. Every interaction, every word, every gesture was calculated to plant doubt in him, to make him stumble without realizing it. At night, when the house was quiet and the farm bathed in moonlight, Margaret allowed herself to feel the bitterness, the heartbreak, and the anger. She did not suppress it, she harnessed it, letting it fuel her determination. Daniel had thought that pushing her down the stairs had defeated her. He had underestimated a mother's love for her land, a woman's resilience, and the slow, patient power of a mind honed by decades of survival. By the time winter approached, Margaret's plan was already taking shape. Daniel had no idea how carefully she was orchestrating her quiet revenge. It would not be violent, but it would be complete, and it would be sweet. Every step she took, every alliance she formed, every legal detail she prepared was a step toward reclaiming not just the farm, but the dignity and justice that Daniel had tried to steal from her. In the silence of her study, Margaret whispered to herself, her eyes glinting with quiet fire, "You thought you could break me, Daniel, but the real storm is yet to come, and when it hits, you will realize that nothing can destroy what is mine." By the time spring rolled over the Pennsylvania hills, Margaret had become a quiet force to be reckoned with. Her recovery was nearly complete, her body strong, her mind sharper than ever. The farm, her sanctuary and legacy, had been fortified not with fences alone, but with strategy, allies, and evidence. Daniel still walked the grounds, confident, careless, blinded by his own arrogance. He did not see the trap that had been laid, nor did he recognize the calm, unshakable determination in his mother's eyes. Margaret began to unravel Daniel's schemes with subtle precision. She meticulously documented his attempts to manipulate finances, gather false support from the local council, and pressure the neighbors into siding with him. Every forged signature, every whispered threat, every deceitful promise was quietly collected and organized. Margaret had learned to wield patience as a weapon, and she used it to her advantage, letting Daniel's impatience grow while she built a case that could not be ignored. She also rallied the community in her own quiet way. Neighbors who had witnessed Daniel's anger, who had felt the ripple of his cruelty, now found themselves quietly supporting Margaret. Their loyalty was not demanded. It was earned over years of kindness and dedication. They saw her not as a fragile elderly woman, but as the guardian of the farm, the keeper of a legacy that belonged to them all in spirit. Then the moment came. Daniel made his usual rounds, confident that intimidation and bluster would secure his claim. But Margaret was ready. She presented the evidence she had gathered, clear, undeniable proof of financial misconduct, manipulation, and threats. The community rallied, the local authorities intervened, and Daniel's schemes began to unravel like a thread pulled from an old quilt. For a brief moment, Margaret allowed herself a quiet smile. Justice was hers, sweet and deliberate. The farm remained in her hands, her father's memory honored, her years of labor protected. But even in triumph, there was a pang of sorrow. She had lost something precious, not the land, but the son who had betrayed her. That wound would never fully heal. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the fields, Margaret walked the rows of crops she had nurtured for decades. She breathed in the scent of earth and growth, feeling both grief and victory intertwined. Her heart was heavy, but her spirit soared. "You thought you could take everything from me, Daniel," she whispered to the wind, "but you forgot. A mother's love, her strength, and her wisdom are not so easily broken." In the quiet of the farm, justice had been served, and Margaret stood tall, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life, her legacy, and her dignity.